Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you a long-awaited Deadtime Stories book review. I know I haven't done one of these in a few years, and I'm glad to be back with the series again. And I have here a review for book number 17, Fairy Tale. Now this was a first-time read for me. When I was younger, I did manage to get my hands on a select few Deadtime Stories books at my local library, along with other series like Choose Your Own Nightmare and Spine Tinglers when I was in my initial Goosebumps obsession when I was back in elementary school. And I don't think I ever saw this book at my library, so I didn't know about it until years later when I started to collect this series, and I managed to get my hands on a copy of this. And I heard within the rumor mills that this was one of the highest coveted books from the series. And for a lot of people who've covered the series, this is their absolute favorite book within the series. So I had high hopes going into this. And I have to say off the bat, I was a bit disappointed given the pedestal this book was put on. But I still had a fun enough time with it. And for those of you that don't know, this book right here is the rarest book in the series, if not one of the rarest kids' horror books, period, out there to purchase. As a matter of fact, if you look for this on sale online, you're probably not going to find a copy, and if you do, maybe one or two pop up a year from experience. So good luck to you out there trying to get this book in your collection or finding a copy just to read. But I would say that it's worth checking out because of the concept alone. I think this concept is kind of fresh, even for its time and kids' horror in general. So take that for what you will. So with that out the way, let's get into the plot overview of Fairy Tale without giving too much away. So this book is about these two twins named Colin and Quint. And the main perspective, I guess, you get in this book is Colin. But like every other Deadtime Stories book, in case you don't know this about the series, every book, for the most part, is written in third person. So you don't really get a monologue with the characters. But Colin is pretty much the central character you need to care about. So Colin is sleeping one night in his bunk bed with his twin brother, and he has a pain in his mouth because one of his molars are becoming loose. And, it's getting around the age of the boys are around 12 or so. So their baby teeth molars are starting to get replaced by their permanent teeth. And this one tooth is really bothering Colin. It's keeping him up a little bit. But he manages to fall asleep. But he's awakened to a sudden feeling on his chest, let's just say. And when he looks up, he sees this small fairy-like creature with a pair of pliers opening up his mouth and reaching in to pull his tooth out. And he's having pretty much a panic attack, and he can't scream. He has pretty much no energy to let out any noise while this is going on. And he's hearing the fairy talk. The pliers start to hurt his tooth, so he finally manages enough energy to scream out, which startles the fairy, and he darts off. And the sound of the screaming wakes up his younger brother, who's sleeping above him. And his younger brother is like, "What's going on?" And Colin's like, "You're not going to believe this, Quint, but there was a fairy on top of my chest, and he was trying to pull out my tooth." And Quint's like, yeah, quit pulling my chain. He's like, "No, I'm being serious. This is actually happening." And the parents come in the room, and they're asking, is everything all right? And Colin's like, yeah, don't worry about it. And the parents are okay, and they go back to sleep. But the next morning, after the boys awaken, Colin realizes that his tooth is missing. And he assumes that the fairy must have come back while he was sleeping and took his tooth. And he maintains his story to Quint. And when he goes downstairs for breakfast, he learns that Quint might have spilled the beans to his parents about him having this idea of a tooth fairy. And his parents are like, I thought you were kind of out of this phase of believing in the tooth fairy, yada, yada. And they seem to think that he must have lost his tooth in his sleep. And he's like, "No, I got to prove to them that this actually happened." And luckily for him, the following night, his brother Quint, he has a tooth that needs to be pulled from the dentist because of a tooth that's coming in. And Quint has this interaction with what he thinks is a tooth fairy, which puts the boys on the same page. The parents come in and they're like, yeah. Quint lost a tooth and he's in a lot of pain. And they're like, well, maybe it's your teeth that you both of you boys have lost, or might be lost in the carpet or something. We can look for it later. And the boys know what's up. They match up their stories and they're like, no, there's these fairies here. We got to catch them. So they set up this ambush for the following night as well. And they pretend to be asleep. And sure enough, these fairies appear. And there's multiple of them. And the boys essentially try to hold them down and capture them, which startles the fairies. And then once the parents come up to investigate the noise, the fairies poof away. And the boys seem to speculate that they are either interdimensional beings or something that can, kind of phase in and out of like existing and stuff like that. And their parents are probably not going to believe their story, so they're going to have to find a way to prove that these fairies exist in another form. And what turns out to be an opportunity kind of fallen into their lap, so to speak, one of the fairies dropped essentially a map that leads to, I guess, where they're from. And there's this very detailed map like drawn out and stuff. And the boys notice that it resembles the woods nearby their home. And they're like, well, the logical conclusion is they must be out in the woods somewhere. Let's go investigate, and we'll go out. So while their parents are sleeping later on, they decide to break out of their house through their window, and they head into the woods with the map. They got some flashlights, some snacks and equipment for the trip, and they make their journey out into the woods to find these tooth fairies. But the story takes a weird turn from this point on. It stops becoming about trying to find these tooth fairies more so than that these boys kind of stumble into a real life fairy tale, but like a blend of a bunch of them. And they soon realize, after they meet these two kids who are sleeping out by a tree in the woods randomly, who go by Hansel and Gretel, that these people that are out in the woods might be what they deem as rejects, involving fairy tale or folklore legends that the boys are pretty much well versed in. So, like I said, they meet these two kids, Hansel and Gretel, who they think are like, what are you trying to be? What is it, Hansel and Gretel? And they're like, we don't know what you're talking about. So they coined the term rejects for them because they're obviously mimicking the folklore legend and why they're there. And the fact is, I think they're on this path on the map called the Reject Path, which kind of inspires the name as well. But nonetheless, they find these two kids, and the kids are like, we're looking for food, we're starving, can you help us? And Colin and Quint kind of look at each other and like, well, why not? The more the merrier. We need all the help we can get to these tooth fairies. But they end up stumbling across a witch's house made out of like gingerbread, and the other two kids are so hungry they stop and just start eating the house. And Colin and Quint are like, well, these kids, they're not gonna stop eating the house, and obviously everything is weird going on with them. We need to abandon them. But when they try to abandon them, they get pretty much captured by this witch who kind of resembles the witch from the Hansel and Gretel folktale. And she brings them through a back door of the house while the other kids are eating. And essentially, she tries to make Colin her like slave, essentially, and wants to eat Quint. And the boys have to find a way out of that scenario, and they pretty much manage to do so. And they kind of abandon Hansel and Gretel and the witch. But they end up stumbling across this girl named Blue. And Blue is looking for some help trying to find her grandfather's house. And the kids are like, well, what's your full name, Blue? You seem nice. And she's like, I'm Little Blue Riding Hood. So she's like a reject version of Little Red Riding Hood. And sure enough, they stumble across her grandfather's house. She goes inside to say hi to him. But she says the whole, oh, Grandpa, what big eyes you have, what big teeth you have. And then all of a sudden there's a scream because Quint went to accompany her to help. Colin goes in there and sees that there's a wolf by himself. His brother, the grandfather, and Blue are missing. And Colin realizes that, like the legend, the locals had to capture the wolf, pretty much cut its stomach open, and release the people that the wolf ate. So that's the logical conclusion Colin comes to, but he has no help and he's being chased out of the house. But then he stumbles across a guy named Big Ed who's carrying pretty much a 12 gauge shotgun. And he's a play on like a modern Mad Maxian Robin Hood. He's like big and buff. He's like a take no crap from nobody guy. And Colin pretty much recruits him to capture the wolf, bring him to this pit out in the middle of the woods. And from there, Big Ed tells him to go back and try to come up with a concoction at the grandfather's house that's so disgusting it's going to make the wolf get sick, to vomit him out, because for some reason Colin and Big Ed don't believe in cutting open the wolf to free the people that the wolf ate. So Colin goes back to the grandfather's house and finds like dog poop and the slugs and the grossest things ever, and puts them into like a drink and makes the wolf drink it, which doesn't necessarily work. But within the wolf eating it, I guess the contents inside his stomach already thought it was gross and pretty much forced them from the inside out to throw him up. And then Blue, her grandfather, and Quint are freed. And once Quint is freed, Big Ed, Blue, and the grandfather are all talking, trying to figure out what to do next. And they're like, well, this is safety in numbers. The wolf, we had to make a deal with him to go free. Why don't we stick together and try to, finish this map? And Big Ed sees the map. He's like, well, I know where this is. I can take you there, and offers to help Colin and Quint. But unfortunately for the boys, while they're receiving help from them, they get separated and they end up veering far off course and falling into what they think is quicksand. And they're panicked, they're screaming for help. And then these elves on motorcycles, like a biker gang of elves, come up to this pit and pretty much tell them that, hey, this isn't a quicksand or mud pit or anything. This is like a former outhouse. And the kids realize they've been swimming in crap, essentially. And they're grossed out by it, and they got a crap all in their mouths. It's really gross. And the dwarves are like, you know what? We feel sorry for you. We'll pull you out, and we'll let you stay at our lodge for the night. And the boys are kind of happy, but also weirded out by the situation, and understand that these elves are like Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. And they keep mentioning this woman named Snow Black, who's asleep at the cottage with them. It's kind of funny. But while Colin and Quint are there, Colin kind of falls asleep and has this weird dream sequence that his parents kind of revealed to him, that him and his brother perhaps are actual fairies. And once he realizes that it was all a dream and he wakes up inside of the elf's home, he starts to kind of question if the dream had maybe some validity to it. He doesn't really know what to believe. But all he knows is that him and Quint need to get to where they need to go as fast as possible so they can get back home. This kind of reminds the urgency of getting this accomplished so they can go back home so their parents know that they're okay. And the elves agree to take them as far as they can take them to this final boss of sorts of the book, which ties back to the beginning of the story. This is like a castle where the tooth fairies are said to live. However, the castle is shrunken, so in order for them to be able to go inside, they have to shrink down. And Colin and Quint eventually do so, and they make their way inside of the castle, and they meet this woman named the Queen Faerie, who essentially drops a bombshell about what this means for Colin and Quint. And there may or may not be some dolls involved that might involve their fate or their human identity. And we never get to really see what happens with the actual fairies from the beginning of the book, but we get an understanding that Colin and Quint need to get out. And they may or may not do so, and possibly end up back home, but the ending forces on a twist to essentially say the story's not over for them, and it leaves on a cliffhanger. And nonetheless, that's pretty much what you're going to expect out of this book, Fairy Tale. So yeah, this book sounded all over the place. It really was. It's been a while since I've read a book that is pretty much what a lot of Goosebumps fans or kids horror fans call affectionately, throw some random crap in there. This is that kind of book if I've ever seen it. I have yet to find a book that has mystified me as much on that front. And made me kind of chuckle just by how out there it is at times. But I have to say, I had a quite fun time with this, and I have some decent positives to say about this book. Off the bat, Deadtime stories, in terms of the writing, here's the biggest issue up front. I guess we'll start with this as a negative for the whole series I've seen so far. A.G. Cascone, if you don't know, is Anna and Gina Cascone, who pretty much created this series. If you don't know anything else they've been associated with, they did like a handful of young adult horror books in the 90s, and they also did 2 Ghost of Fear Street books. I think it was Attack of the Aqua Apes and The Eye of the Fortune Teller, which some fans have considered those 2 books honorary Deadtime Stories books. So take that for what you will. But their biggest issue is that because there's 2 writers, sometimes the writing can feel scatterbrained, and you can clearly tell where one writer left off and the other began. And on top of that, because it's third person, there's a lack of monologue to really understand how these characters are. The closest thing you get for characterization is just basically clear arcs that the plot is kind of trotting them through, or maybe characteristics in their interactions with other characters, which can be good and can be bad at times. But as a result of that practice, a lot of the time they're kind of just telling you what's happening in the book as opposed to showing you. However, within this book, the whole narration is kind of framed like a narrator of a fairy tale would narrate it. And it's very bizarre, but it works for this type of book. I think Colin and Quint's sibling relationship is very charming. While they're not the greatest characters ever, they have really good dynamics in the story, and you can clearly tell that they're polar opposites. In the beginning of the book, I didn't touch on this because it's not really important. Colin is more nerdy. He's into comic books, he's into nerddom and stuff like that, while Quint is more into sports. And throughout the story, it's ironic that Quint always finds himself in peril more than Colin, and he has to kind of make himself the hero and do all the buff lifting that his identical twin brother would normally do. And it's fun to see that inflection on their relationship. And the side characters in this story can be fun at times, like the Mad Maxian Big Ed guy, who's a parody of Robin Hood. He's a trip. The 7 dwarves with motorcycles, they're a trip. The Blue Red Riding Hood and the grandpa have some funny lines here and there when they're in the story. It's kind of like these characters are made to be farces of their source material counterparts. And in a lot of ways, they do work, despite how random they are. And I will say the villains early on in the story, the Tooth Fairy or the Fae, coming to take the kids' teeth, they're written kind of creepy. And what they do to these kids it gets to you a little bit. And there's some scenes in the book, we're getting down to some positives with some out there scenes, especially when we're getting into the woods stuff after the first 6 chapters, where we're getting the fairies pulling out the teeth with pliers. You see people with shotguns, pretty much capturing a wolf, holding it at gunpoint. You see bikers. I skipped over this scene because it's not important at all, but the biker dwarves get into a fight with a rival elf gang. It's just weird. And the way they fight each other isn't with violence, but with harsh words. It's kid-friendly. Got to remember that, y'all. And I think the AG, Anna and Gina Cascone here, they have a sense of humor, or I guess a dry sense of humor that sometimes lands in that vein. So they can make something corny kind of funny at the same time. But yeah, there's some pretty solid moments in this book that, itch a scratch, I would say. The concept of this book is probably the most love or hated thing about it for me as well. I do have a positive and a negative with it. Either way, I think the first 6 chapters is trying to do a whole different story that the final 3 chapters feels compelled to come back to. But majority of this book feels like a whole different story, like a farce on fairy tales. And it kind of feels like a fantasy, even more deep-rooted fantasy version of Beast from the East or some random book from the OG 62, like Legend of the Lost Legend or something, which is weird. Which brings me to my negatives, I have to say, off the bat. The first 6 chapters, okay, is about tooth fairies pretty much harming these boys, trying to take their teeth, and the boys want to prove that these tooth fairies exist and want to capture them to get their revenge and prove to their parents that they do exist. But most of the book, once they get into the woods, isn't even about tooth fairies. It's like the plot forgets about that objective, and it just becomes a hodgepodge of randomness happening. And unfortunately, at points, it does feel like, okay, can we get on with it? Can we get back to the tooth fairy stuff? And after a certain point, you kind of give up on that hope, because so much of the book has gone by. And that was frustrating for me while reading this. I'm like, okay, so the first 6 chapters don't really mean anything on this part of the story, because I guess they're going for a ride more than the destination here, or the escalation. And that kind of harmed the book for me, I will say. It feels like the first 6 chapters are its own tangent, and then chapter 7 through maybe chapter 27 is its own tangent, and then the final 3 chapters are trying to pretty much stop the chapter 7 through 27 and come back to the first 6 chapters. It's bizarre. Like, I don't know why the book was laid out like this. It seems like they just forgot what they were doing early on in the book. And it just feels so scatterbrained. It's bizarre. And that leads me into my second huge negative with the book as a whole, is the destination, y'all. The feeling compelled to come back to these tooth fairies. You would think that these two fairies on the cover, who I think are supposed to be the villains that we saw in the first 6 chapters, would mean something by the end, but you don't even see them. They never come back in the story. And the final 3 chapters are so rushed through. It's trying to speed through this final boss fight, I guess, of the Queen Fairy, and this really lazy, motive of why they're in the castle, what's going to happen to them feels left field. And you're like, how does this have anything to do with fairies abducting teeth from these 2 children? It literally makes 0 sense. And feeding on to that, the ending is so corny. It's so corny and tacked on, especially when you look at the final few sentences. You're like, really? I feel like the book needed a lot more care, and it needed just to pick a lane, honestly. If you're going to be a story about tooth fairies stealing teeth from kids, and these kids want revenge on the fairies, why not incorporate them on this bizarre journey in the woods through, reject fairy tales? That still could have worked, and you still could have had that concept, but you don't see the fairies anywhere. And even at that, if you wanted to make a farce about fairy tales and just go full-on fantasy with it, why couldn't you just do that in the whole book? At least it would have been somewhat coherent. You could have made it like a fun Wizard of Oz spoof type of thing, but incorporating all these old folk tales and fairy tales in the mix, and it could have been kind of entertaining. But the end product just comes off so jumbled that it's kind of hard to hold in high regard. And my last negative, I guess, with the book is the sheer fact of, when it comes down to the execution of the idea, it could have been a whole lot better than it was, and it just comes off disappointing. And I just feel disappointed with it, because there's so much potential in here that it saddens me to see a book end up like this. And it's almost pretty much a train wreck in a lot of ways. But that doesn't shortchange the entertaining moments and the character stuff that I enjoyed, and the humor, and some good scenes. Those are sound things to kind of combat that, but that is something that I take to heart with this. So from a 0 to 5 star basis for Fairy Tale here, I'm going to be honest, y'all. I struggle with this, because this book has textbook issues that a C-tier Goosebumps book would have. And on the relatability to Goosebumps, this kind of has like that Ghost of Fear Street Goosebumps vibes all over it, even though it's Deadtime Stories. And Deadtime Stories is known for doing more fantasy, sci-fi stuff, more than abject horror. So take that for what you will. But it has a lot of similar issues that C-tier Goosebumps has, so I was thinking that's where I wanted to put it. However, I was conflicted between around a 3.7 to a 4 given those issues. I know I made a big deal out of them, and trust me, they're pretty medium-sized ones to high-hitting ones at points. But collectively, I wanted to put this book here because I like it just as much as the first Deadtime Stories book I reviewed, which was It Came From the Deep. I gave that book a 3.7. And while I think that book has its own problems of just feeling bloated and hard to read at times because of how bloated the book is, this one, it doesn't have bloat, but it's hard to read for its own reasons because it's so scatterbrained. And it kind of reminds me of the 3 books I've read so far, including this one, It Came From the Deep, and Night of the Pet Zombies, of just the ailments the series has as a whole in totality. And this one kind of shows some of the uglier sides of this series. More so than the other 2 at times. So I'm willing to give this book the same rating I gave It Came From the Deep at a 3.7 out of 5. And I deducted 1.3 off the top from a perfect 5 for all those issues I mentioned. So is this book the best Deadtime Stories book in my opinion? Nah. I think I still widely prefer Night of the Pet Zombies, even though that book has its own issues. I think it was still solid for the most part, even though that book can be meandering and kind of missed on some potential there. I don't think it was as jarring as this book could be at times. But I do think that this was a good book. Like, especially for knockoffs. If we're talking knockoffs, there are some knockoffs that I think are more up my alley and I think are just better and more entertaining, or at least more streamlined and concise. This one is a bit unpredictable, and that could be a blessing or a curse for a lot of you out there, especially if you ever get lucky enough to come across this book. I can totally see people being way more in love with this book than me, and I can really understand people if you read this and absolutely hate it at the same time. So, yeah, it's going to be one of those divisive ones, I feel. But the overwhelming praise I see throughout the community, at least most of the community enjoys this book or absolutely loves it. I like it, but, you know, experience it for yourself at the end of the day. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Fairy Tale. Let me know down in the comment section if you have read this book before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.